Hello. This is the second in a series of lectures on the principles and practice of using woody plants in the landscape in the Woody Landscape Plants course of the Prairie Horticultural Certificate program. In the first lecture I talked about the function of woody plants in the landscape and introduced the concept of design elements that are inherent or manifested in woody plants. I talked about form and line. Today I want to complete this and talk about color and texture. When you're thinking of color, one of the first things that comes to mind is the color wheel. Now there are several kinds of color wheels which have different colors on them. A classic one is the one with the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, as you see here in the picture, often used by artists. And the colors in between these primary colors are known as secondary colors, and there can be tertiary colors. We will look a little bit at the relationship of these a little later. When you think of color, the word color is actually another word for the word hue. Hue is another word for color, if you like. But how do these hues work when we think about using them, say, in a landscape or in a design? Well, it's shown that warm colors such as red, yellow, and orange give an illusion of the space or of objects advancing towards us. So it actually can reduce the impact of a large space. In other words, you have a large space, you have warm colors, it makes it feel a little bit smaller. Think about that picture for a moment and how it's sort of in your face, to use a term. Now look at cooler colors such as the green, blue, or violet. They give a sense of fading away and increase the apparent size of a space. So it gives you more feeling of more space. If you have a small yard and you use cooler colored plants, for example, then it'll give you a little bit of an illusion of more space. Just take a look going backwards. Here's the bright color. You can see it sort of in your face, the warm color, and then the receding quality of the cooler color. This is just a picture from the window of when I was on sabbatical in Calgary years ago at the university, and unfortunately I don't have the picture in the summer to show when it's green. It shows that it's basically further away, but when the fall colors came on, you could start to see that it changed the feel of the landscape. So when you go out in the fall and you see the bright colors or the warm colors as opposed to the cooler colors, think about the difference in how it actually looks. There's more to color than just hue, though. You can see hue here on around the wheel. There's also the whole notion of how much color, actually pure color, there is, say when you're making paint or something. If it's completely just that color, then it's considered to be quite saturated, and you get really strong, say, reds or whatever color, or blues or whatever color you're doing, and you can have varying degrees of that. Then there's a whole notion of whether it's bright or dark, and that's termed value. Whether if it's got a lot of white, then it's kind of light. If it's got a lot of dark, black rather, it's then dark. So this whole notion of intensity or saturation then is the actual color content, the amount of pure color or brightness, whereas this notion of value is the amount of actual lightness or darkness in the color, depending on the, adding white or black. For example, navy is a dark value of a typical blue. So when you think of navy blue, that's a dark blue, as we all know. Now, lightness is similar to the warm color idea. Lightness can increase the apparent distance and make that if you paint a room black or you paint a room white, it's going to change the size or the feeling of the illusion of size of the room. So lightness increases the apparent distances, darkness reduces the apparent size of an area. So this can be also used when it comes to landscaping as well. Now another notion is the whole notion of whether you have monochromatic or polychromatic color schemes. This is a monochromatic color scheme which is based on different shades of blue. So that's called monochromatic, and sometimes people use that in landscaping, create a whole bed of different shades of pink or different shades of yellow and so on. Here's an example of a monochromatic with different shades of yellow. They're different intensities and values of one particular hue. Polychromatic, on the other hand, is when you have many colors from the color wheel in your landscape. Now, some people just will put anything in there and it doesn't matter, but if you're thinking about things that actually match, like I guess trying to match your clothing, you can use the notion of complementary colors. These are hues that are opposite on the color wheel. You can see here they work well together generally. You've got and make strong contrast. So things like yellow and green go well with blues and purples. So you can sort of see they're more or less opposite on the color wheel. They create strong contrast. Here's an example. Here's yellow here, and this is not a very good example, but it is kind of a purple color. That's not a great example. Here's a painting though with complementary colors that shows blues and oranges. So those are complementary colors there. Now, again, you can here's an example. These go not too bad together, but as I say, a lot of people in landscaping just put anything together. So, but it's not always necessarily the best idea. There's another notion of polychromatic, which is not opposite on the color wheel, but is actually more closely beside it on the color wheel, and these are called analogous colors. So you take 3 to even 5 colors, depending on how you break these colors down on the color wheel, but you take adjacent colors on the color wheel, and those are usually called analogous colors. And they provide not very much contrast, such as you see here in this painting. Here's an example of a few analogous colors out in the landscape, and you can see that they work well together, but they don't provide a lot of contrast. It's not very far away sometimes from the whole notion of the whole notion of monochromatic. It's not the same, but it's kind of has a similar effect. Well, let's take a look at it in terms of plants then. Basically, one thing we got to remember is with plants, we have a lot of different hues, and we have a lot of different kinds of, shades of different colors, even in the landscape. And the idea is that normally this is the sort of common thing when we think of leaves and plants in the summer, green. But we know in landscaping we have lots of different choices, such as reddish colors, deep red. We got silvery colors. We've got yellow, and we can have some of these things where we have variegated colors, where we have a mixture that can create a bit of a silver hue, and you have white mixed with green. So lots of variation in the summer landscape, and think about the complementary colors that work well together. Think about the analogous colors and so on. Fall is another time when you have lots of color variation. Just so you realize that in the prairies, yellow is the most common color that you'll find, but in the landscape industry you'll find, and in the shrubs, you'll find a lot more examples of sort of similar, you see here, orange and reds you can find out there. So when you want to use shrubs, you can find reds. And there are some trees that are used, such as autumn blaze maple, which is a cross between silver and red maple, so you can get nice fall color. I've got one in my backyard here in Salmon Arm, and it's blazing red right now, deep red. So you can actually select those out of the nursery if fall color is your objective. And then of course there's the winter color. If you have evergreens, you'll have green. Another thing is about stems. Stems have all sorts of colors, and one thing about stems is they're there all the time. So think about that. That's an important thing to consider. Here you have the whole notion of everything from red to white to golden yellows, but a typical ones are gray, but here's sort of an olive green and even sort of a kind of a cinnamon color. So you have lots of variation in stems, and that's something important to consider when you're landscaping, is the winter landscape, because it's there for a long time in the prairies, as we know. Flowers are something that in woody plants last typically only 1 to 2 weeks, but sometimes can last longer. Herbaceous perennials, on the other hand, typically will last a little longer than your average woody plants, 3 to 4 weeks, but there are some examples that last a lot longer. These are just sort of averages. And then annuals, we often plant those because they'll bloom from the time we put them in till frost. But having said that, they're not there for a long time, but they're there for a good time. Or having said that, we can look at some of these. Some of these are spring that you don't hardly even notice, and some of the trees. But even a lot of the plums and the crab apples and the rose family have a very short flowering time. But there are some plants that have a longer time flowering, such as potentilla. As we know, roses will often flower and then recur several times over the course of the season, so you could consider that along, or hydrangeas. And there's this kind of some dogwoods we can grow out here in BC that are a little more difficult to deal with in the prairies, but the Satomi dogwood, the flowers last for a long time. So there are some things you can select in woody plants that do last for a long time. And fruit is again another characteristic. A lot of these fruits will persist into winter, and they have lots of different colors and characteristics, sizes and shapes, and some of them you can eat too. So do consider the fruit as another ornamental characteristic and in terms of color. The last element I want to talk about is texture, and this is related to not only the whole plant but also the plant components. Texture is one of those underutilized elements sometimes. And first of all, let's start with looking at objects. When we look at an object, we can actually perceive texture without even having to touch the object. Our brain can actually interpret texture as being, say, smooth or rough just without looking at it, but of course touching it is the ultimate way to tell. So it is a visual interpretation of whether something's rough or smooth. Now, when you're looking at an object in the landscape, I guess you could, this is a stem, you could ask, well, is this smooth or is this rough? I think that you could say that relative to most woody trunks, this would probably be considered smooth. But you could argue that it's rough relative to the surface of a table, for example. But here's an example of definitely a rough bark on a tree, and you can see the difference is quite dramatic. Now when it comes to whole plants, we usually think of them, they're not really solid. There's spaces between branches and leaves and so on. So we have to really consider that when we're thinking about whole plants. So we don't talk about texture of plants as being rough or smooth. We talk about it being coarse or fine. And many parts or characteristics make up whether a plant is considered coarse or fine. It's a result of how much foliage you have or how many branches you have. If there's lots of space between the foliage, then it's usually a coarser texture. If it's really close together and it's just all one mass, then it looks a little finer, for example. Secondly, the leaf size and shape. Odd shapes and large leaves will impart a coarse texture. And I deal with this quite a bit in my CD-ROM for those that you might have it under the Woody Plant Characteristics button. Branch thickness. Thicker branches impart a coarser texture to a plant than finer branches. Color of branches and foliage do as well. Dark colors may give an illusion or impression of a coarser texture. And again, the surface texture, the roughness or smoothness also contributes to how the whole plant its texture. So for example, if you have rough components, it'll impart a more coarse texture to the plant. And I'm going to illustrate that with this little sort of a visual table. You can see here what happens is that I've got it in 4 categories. You've got summer, winter, and then coarse, and then fine. And you can see here in the summertime, of course, the dominant feature is often the leaves. Now, a lot of times it's the size of the leaves, but it also this is, of course, not summer, this is in fall, but anyway, it's still got its leaves on. So dark, large leaves in the summer are going to give it a more coarse texture than this Carigana with their very small leaflets, lighter color. Winter, similar, but now the dominant feature are the stems, and you've got things like in terms of bur oak, it's a very coarse texture. It's well illustrates all the characteristics. It's a lot of space between the branches, thick branches, rough, quirky surface texture of all the branches, a dark color to the branches. Taken all together gives you a very coarse texture. Conversely, a weeping birch with lots of thin, light-colored shoots and branches imparts a much finer texture. So, to complete that, a fine texture, similar to color, when we're looking at color, we can use texture to actually change the illusion of space. A fine texture makes a space look larger. A coarse texture makes a space seem smaller. So if you have a large yard and you want it to close it up a bit, use more coarse textures. If you have a little yard and you want to make it feel a little bit bigger, use plants with a finer texture. So that's all for this lecture, and I will move on to landscape design process in the 3rd lecture in this series.